Hey, this is Jake with Associate PI. Today we are breaking down the CPCU 500 exam. We're going over a study guide, so we're breaking down each chapter and what is important from each chapter. And again, presented by Associate PI. We're an independent organization, independent from the CPCU designation and the institutes. I'm a CPCU myself, so I'm just here to help you pass your exam, in particular the CPCU 500. And this is video number 6 now of our 8-part video series. You can go back and check out all the videos from the CPCU 500 video series at AssociatePI.com/videos. So today we're going over the 8 chapters of the exam. There are 8 primary topics and chapters of the 500 exam. You can see them here: risk management, loss exposures, risk assessment, risk control, risk financing, big data, insurance policies, and insurance concepts. So now we're going to get into each chapter and go over what is important about each chapter. So the first chapter is about risk management. We actually do have a free Chapter 1 course over at AssociatePI.com/courses. You can check out and get the entire free Chapter 1 of the CPCU 500 exam for free, so you can get used to the type of content that you're going to see on this exam, because Chapter 1 is pretty important. There won't be a lot of questions on your exam from Chapter 1, but it sets up the entire purpose of the exam. It covers all of the topics in a little bit of detail, and then the remaining 7 chapters of the exam covered in more detail, but it kind of sets the groundwork, so it's really important to understand Chapter 1, get an understanding for what's going to be in the exam. So in this case, Chapter 1, what's important is risk. It's going to talk about, the 500 exam is all about risk and risk management. So Chapter 1 breaks down what is risk, what are the elements of it. One important thing is pure risk versus speculative risk. There's going to be some of those questions on your exam, so make sure you know those 2 definitions, know the difference of each. And then another one that's going to be on your exam is the goals of risk management and the risk management process. So make sure you know that, because there probably will be a couple questions on your exam. Not too many, but then again, you will likely see a couple of these questions on the 500 exam. Chapter 2 is talking all about loss exposures. So there's 4 types of loss exposures that you need to know. You need to know all the minor details about these 4 exposures. The 4 are liability, net income, personnel, and property. One mistake I made is spending too much time memorizing each exposure and characteristic. Don't do this. Just focus on the broad overview, what these exposures are, and understand the methods to identify and just memorize these loss exposures and know the high-level topics, because this will be on your exam as well. Chapter 3 is a risk assessment. So this is primarily based on probability and dispersion. So this is things such as variance, standard deviation, coefficient of variation. These are some statistical measures. You won't need to calculate standard deviation. We're going to give you the formula on how to calculate it. That's more for your own knowledge. The exam won't get that technical and make you calculate it, but you do need to know the purpose of standard deviation, what's meant by a higher standard deviation versus lower standard deviation, when to use standard deviation versus coefficient of variation, whether high or low is better. So this is really all about probability and understanding dispersion from the mean. So essentially you're trying to figure out statistically what is how standard deviation and coefficient of variation help you better predict claims in the insurance world. So that's it. This chapter gets pretty technical. The topics are kind of tough, especially if you've never taken a statistics class in the past. So this one's going to be a little tough, but here's the main focus is know the difference between theoretical and empirical probability. That's going to be on your exam. You're going to have to know those 2 definitions and the difference between each. Same as discrete probability and continuous probability. Know one example of each, know the definitions. Standard deviation, as I mentioned, very important, knowing the practical application of it. You don't need to know how to calculate it, but know how to apply it. And this last one is really tricky. It incorporates standard deviation, but it's called the normal distribution curve. That's a normal distribution curve. You can Google it to see how the curve looks. Just look up some images. But this is actually going to be a pretty important one. It's a curve, and it has these different buckets of it shows like a 0.5 standard deviation, a standard deviation of 1, and what the probability is of landing in those buckets. So you're going to have to know how to use this curve and how to apply it to a real life scenario, because you will see this in a Part B exam question, and it can be really tricky. So understand how to use the normal curve and how to use that, applying it to probabilities. Now, Chapter 4, this is where it gets important. Chapter 4 is one of the two most important chapters. We say that the risk control chapter, which is this one, Chapter 4, is on risk control, and the risk financing chapter are the two most important chapters of the exam. So you have to know, what is risk control, what are the risk control techniques, what's the purpose of risk control, and what are the risk control goals. So the techniques that you need to memorize these, understand a couple of examples of each, and know the differences between each. So you want to know avoidance, diversification, duplication, loss prevention, loss reduction, and separation. Memorize those, memorize what each of them means. The goals, the risk control goals, memorize all of these. The exam is going to try and trick you. It's going to give you a question, and it's going to mix and mingle risk control goals with the risk financing goals. So make sure you know the difference between risk control goals and risk financing goals. That's going to get a little tricky. And also important, know the difference between effective versus efficient risk control. I think we covered this in video series part 4, where we broke down CPCU 500 exam questions part A, where we went over a concept question breaking down the difference between effective versus efficient risk control. So go back and check out that video if you want to see an example of how this chapter is tricky and will try to trick you. And here is the second most important chapter. This is the chapter on risk financing, chapter number 5. So similar thing here, know the risk financing goals. So risk financing is essentially insurance. It's retention, which is like a deductible, or transfer, which is insurance. So those are the two main topics of risk financing. So know the goals of risk financing. Like I said, the exam is going to try and trick you with a risk control versus risk financing goals. So know these goals, know that it improves liquidity, it helps with legal compliance, limits the variability of cash flows, pays for losses, and reduces the cost of risk. Those are the goals that you need to know, memorize them, and compare them to the risk control goals, because the exam is going to try and trick you. Also, you have to know the advantages of retention, which is a type of risk financing, the advantages of transfer, which is a type of risk financing, and the types of risk financing. So that's going to be insurance, deductibles, things like that fall under the risk financing umbrella. So very important chapter here. Make sure you study this one. Chapter 6, this was a new one that was added to the 500 exam content. This was added back maybe an edition or two ago, so it's really not that new anymore. But it's not overly important. There's not going to be too many questions, and the concepts are pretty straightforward here. It's all about big data, which is a new concept that's taking over the insurance environment. If you work in the industry, you are already using big data, so you should be used to it. But here you need to know the big data sources, big data types, what is data science and what is data mining. Probably only going to have a couple questions from this chapter on your exam, but you still need to know these topics. But most of them are definitions and concepts, so not too difficult. Step 7, this is breaking down insurance in general, insurance policies, the policy structure, and really what is an insurance policy. So you have to know the different variations of different types of insurance policies and different characteristics of the policy. This one's pretty important. One thing that I always point out is the DICE method. You have to know that. I know there's going to be a couple questions on your exam, but the DICE method, it's an acronym, so you have to know what DICE means and what each point in the DICE method means and how to apply it to a real life scenario. So make sure you know that one. On top of that, know these other couple things. These are so characteristics of the insurance policy. I know the difference between a self-contained policy versus a modular policy. Know what a pre-printed policy is versus a manuscript policy. And know the difference between a standard and non-standard insurance policy. So a couple concepts there that you need to memorize. Chapter 8, the last chapter of the exam. This one, the most important topic of this section, this chapter, is insurance to value. Now, we covered this in video series part 5, where we broke down a Part B exam question of the CPCU 500 exam. Part B is all about scenario questions, case questions. Go back and review that video if you were interested to see how insurance to value could be applied to a real life scenario, because you're going to need to know that for the exam. You have to know how to calculate it. You have to know what the insurance company is going to pay based on insurance to value, and you have to know what the insurance to value provision is. So make sure you memorize that. Also, make sure you know the different types of deductibles, what a deductible is, and the other sources of recovery outside of insurance. And that's it. Those are the 8 chapters of the exam, everything that's important and what you need to know. So I recommend you go rewatch this video and check out what the important topics are, and make sure you go study those and memorize those concepts. And if you want to download the study guide, you can go to AssociatePI.com/practice exam. You can get this entire study guide with more information. We break down a lot more in our download, and we give you free practice questions. We give you a bunch of questions so you can practice and really memorize and see how these concepts from the study guide will be formatted in an exam question, so that you can practice before you take your exam. And if you want to see more resources, you can see more of the stuff at AssociatePI.com/CPCU 500. So these are all the free blog posts that we post, a bunch of free resources to prepare you for what to expect on your 500 exam. And again, this is video number 6. That wraps up the 6th video in the CPCU 500 video series. You can check out all the videos at AssociatePI.com/videos. And that's it. We will see you on the next video. Good luck on the exam.